By the early 21st century of the Common Era, Australia had reached a point of historical tension it could no longer defer. The law had begun to acknowledge Indigenous connection to land. Governments had issued apologies. Public language had shifted from denial to recognition. Yet one question remained deliberately unresolved: sovereignty. Unlike many other settler colonies, Australia had never signed treaties with its Indigenous peoples. From the moment of colonization, British authorities had assumed sovereignty without negotiation, consent, or formal transfer. This assumption became embedded in law, governance, and national identity. Even as legal doctrines were revised and land rights partially recognized, sovereignty remained untouched. Recognition stopped at the boundary of power. Indigenous Australians increasingly argued that land rights alone were insufficient. If the land had never been ceded, then the authority exercised over it required justification. Sovereignty, in this context, did not necessarily mean the replacement of the Australian state. It meant acknowledgement that Indigenous nations had existed as political entities and continued to exist as such. This argument challenged the deepest foundations of the nation. For governments, sovereignty was treated as settled and non-negotiable. Courts consistently ruled that questions of sovereignty lay beyond their jurisdiction. While judges acknowledged historical injustice, they refused to consider whether the original claim of authority had been lawful. In this way, recognition was carefully limited to avoid destabilizing the state itself. Public debate reflected this tension. Calls for treaties, constitutional recognition, and structural reform gained visibility. At the same time, resistance hardened. Critics warned that acknowledging sovereignty would divide the nation or undermine equality before the law. These concerns echoed earlier fears surrounding land rights, revealing a recurring pattern. Recognition was acceptable only when it did not threaten control. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries of the Common Era, Indigenous political movements reframed their demands. The focus shifted from symbolic inclusion to structural change. Sovereignty was linked to self-determination, decision-making power, and the right to be heard on matters affecting Indigenous lives and lands. This shift exposed the limits of reconciliation as it had been practiced. Apologies addressed past harm, but left present authority unchanged. Land rights acknowledged connection, but preserved ultimate control in the hands of the state. Without addressing sovereignty, reconciliation risked becoming performative. The debate over sovereignty was not abstract. It shaped real policy decisions. Indigenous communities sought greater control over education, health, and land management. They argued that solutions imposed from above had consistently failed. Self-determination was presented not as separatism, but as practical governance grounded in local knowledge and responsibility. Yet the Australian political system struggled to accommodate this vision. Power sharing challenged established hierarchies. Constitutional change required broad consensus that proved difficult to achieve. As a result, sovereignty remained present in rhetoric, but absent in law. By the second decade of the 21st century of the Common Era, it had become clear that recognition without power was insufficient. The unresolved question was no longer whether Indigenous Australians belonged within the nation. It was whether the nation was willing to listen in ways that required change. As debates over sovereignty and self-determination intensified, a new approach began to take shape. Rather than demanding immediate resolution of sovereignty in legal terms, Indigenous leaders increasingly focused on creating a structural mechanism through which their voices could be heard within the existing political system. The aim was not symbolic inclusion, but durable influence. This shift emerged from experience. For decades, Indigenous policy in Australia had been shaped by governments changing direction with electoral cycles. Programs were introduced, reformed, and abandoned with little consultation and minimal long-term impact. Indigenous communities were treated as subjects of policy rather than participants in its design. The result was inconsistency, inefficiency, and deep mistrust. Indigenous leaders argued that this pattern was not accidental. It was the consequence of exclusion from decision-making. Without a guaranteed voice, Indigenous interests were always vulnerable to political convenience. What was needed was a permanent structure that could not be easily ignored. National consultations were held across the country. Indigenous Australians from diverse nations and regions gathered to discuss the future of recognition. These discussions were deliberate and often difficult. They reflected differing priorities, histories, and expectations. Yet a common theme emerged: Recognition without influence was insufficient. From these consultations came a proposal that sought to navigate the limits of Australian constitutional law, while addressing the demand for self-determination. The proposal was simple in form but ambitious in implication. It called for the establishment of an Indigenous advisory body, enshrined in the Constitution, with the power to make representations to Parliament and government on matters affecting Indigenous peoples. This body would not legislate. It would not veto laws. It would not replace existing institutions. Its authority would come from permanence and legitimacy rather than coercive power. By embedding it in the Constitution, Indigenous Australians sought protection from political abolition and a guarantee that their perspectives could not be sidelined. Supporters described this proposal as modest and pragmatic. It did not challenge sovereignty directly. It worked within the existing state. Yet its significance lay precisely in what it altered. For the first time, Indigenous participation in national decision-making would be structural rather than discretionary. Opposition emerged quickly. Critics argued that such a body would create division by race. Others claimed it would undermine parliamentary sovereignty or introduce legal uncertainty. Some rejected the proposal outright, insisting that the nation had already moved beyond the need for special recognition. These arguments echoed earlier resistance to land rights and reconciliation, revealing how deeply questions of authority remained unsettled. The debate revealed a central tension in Australian political culture. Recognition was widely supported in principle, but contested in practice. Many were willing to acknowledge history, but reluctant to alter structures of power shaped by that history. The proposal for a constitutional voice exposed this contradiction. For Indigenous Australians, the proposal represented more than consultation. It was a test of whether the nation was prepared to move beyond symbolic gestures toward shared responsibility. It did not resolve sovereignty. It did not address treaties. But it offered a pathway toward dialogue grounded in respect rather than control. By the time the proposal entered national debate, the stakes were clear. Acceptance would signal a willingness to listen in an enduring way. Rejection would confirm the limits of recognition. When the proposal for a constitutionally protected Indigenous voice entered the national arena, it forced Australia to confront the limits of its own narrative. For decades, the country had described itself as reconciled, inclusive, and forward-looking. The proposal tested whether those descriptions reflected reality or aspiration. Public debate quickly moved beyond the technical details of the proposal. What was contested was not only the structure of the body, but the meaning of recognition itself. Supporters argued that listening was a minimum requirement for justice. Opponents warned that formalizing Indigenous participation would fracture national unity. The same tension that had shaped earlier debates over land and rights resurfaced once again. At the center of this debate was fear of precedent. Acknowledging Indigenous voices in a permanent way raised uncomfortable questions. If Indigenous Australians were to be formally consulted on laws affecting them, what did that imply about sovereignty? If their authority to speak was recognized, what did that say about the assumption that sovereignty had been settled once and for all? These questions were rarely addressed directly, but they shaped the tone of resistance. For many Indigenous Australians, the debate itself was revealing. The proposal did not demand control over government. It did not seek to override Parliament. It asked only for the right to be heard. The intensity of opposition suggested that even this limited shift in power was perceived as threatening. When the proposal was ultimately rejected, the outcome was framed by some as a defense of equality and constitutional stability. By others, it was understood as confirmation that recognition would always stop short of power. The nation was willing to acknowledge history, but not to be changed by it. This moment marked a turning point. For Indigenous communities, the rejection clarified the boundaries of the existing political system. It demonstrated that meaningful recognition could not rely solely on goodwill or symbolic inclusion. Structural change would require persistence beyond single proposals or referendums. The struggle for sovereignty and self-determination would continue, but with fewer illusions about the ease of reform. At the same time, the debate altered public consciousness. Questions of sovereignty, once marginal, entered mainstream discussion. Younger generations engaged with concepts that had long been excluded from national education. Even rejection produced visibility. Silence became harder to maintain. Importantly, Indigenous sovereignty did not disappear because it was unrecognized. It continued to exist in practice, in culture, in law, and in relationship to land. Sovereignty was not something granted by the state. It was something asserted by survival. The Australian state, meanwhile, remained caught between acknowledgment and authority. It recognized Indigenous Australians as the first peoples of the continent. It accepted that the land had never been empty. Yet it continued to operate on foundations laid without consent. This contradiction defined the present. Sovereignty, in this context, was not a demand for separation. It was a demand for honesty. It asked the nation to recognize that its legal and political order had emerged through exclusion, and that justice required more than symbolic gestures. By the early decades of the 21st century of the Common Era, it had become clear that reconciliation without redistribution of power would remain incomplete. Recognition without responsibility would not resolve the past. The question was no longer whether Australia should listen, but how far it was willing to go once it did. This is where the story now stands. The history of Australia is not a closed narrative moving steadily toward resolution. It is an ongoing negotiation between memory and authority, between law and lived reality. Sovereignty remains unsettled not because it is unclear, but because confronting it requires change.